What happens when Britain's most beloved singer faces off against one of morning television's toughest interviewers in a clash so explosive that producers had to step in? It only took 20 seconds for a friendly chat to turn into the most shocking meltdown Good Morning Britain has ever witnessed. Before we reveal what happened, smash that subscribe button right now. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, the confrontations that shake the entertainment world, and the moments that celebrities desperately want erased from history. You won't believe what comes next. Last night's episode of Good Morning Britain started like any other morning show appearance. The studio lights were bright and carefully positioned. The iconic red and white set gleamed under the cameras with that familiar polish that viewers had come to associate with the program, and the energy was upbeat as producers prepared for what they thought would be a straightforward celebrity interview. Production assistants moved efficiently around the studio, checking camera angles, adjusting lighting levels, making sure everything was perfect for broadcast. Cliff Richard, the legendary British singer with a career spanning over 6 decades and countless hit records, was scheduled to appear to discuss his upcoming tour and new music release. His publicist had confirmed the appearance weeks ago, and everyone involved was looking forward to it. Cliff was considered a dream guest for morning television. Always reliable, always gracious, always able to deliver the kind of warm, engaging conversation that audiences loved. The morning show audience tuned in, expecting the usual lighthearted conversation that Cliff was known for delivering in countless interviews over the years. After all, he'd been a fixture on British television since the 60s. Always charming, always professional, always ready with a smile, and a story about his incredible career. He was part of Britain's cultural fabric, someone who'd entertained multiple generations, whose songs were part of the soundtrack of millions of lives. Kate Garraway sat at the desk alongside her co-host, both looking polished and prepared for what seemed like it would be an easy, pleasant segment to start the morning. They'd done their research, had their notes prepared, and had been briefed by producers on the key talking points for the interview. The plan was straightforward. Talk about the tour, the new music, maybe some nostalgic stories from his career, and wrap up with some light banter. Easy, comfortable television. When Cliff walked onto the set, the studio audience greeted him with warm applause that filled the space with genuine affection. He looked distinguished as always, dressed impeccably in a well-tailored suit, waving to the crowd with that familiar showman's grace that had won him millions of fans over the decades. His smile was warm and genuine, his energy positive and engaged. He settled into the guest chair across from Kate and her co-host, adjusting his microphone with practiced ease and exchanging pleasantries with the production crew, thanking them for having him. The interview began smoothly enough. Kate started with the easy questions, the kind designed to warm up a guest and get them comfortable, to establish rapport before moving into anything more substantial. They talked about his upcoming tour dates, running through the cities he'd be visiting, the venues he was excited about performing in. Cliff spoke enthusiastically about returning to the stage, about the excitement of performing live again after recent years had been challenging for live entertainment across the entire industry. He talked about how much he'd missed the energy of a live audience, the immediate connection you get when performing in front of real people. He was animated and engaging, his hands gesturing expressively as he told stories about his career, with genuine warmth and humor. He shared anecdotes about memorable performances, about fans who'd followed him for decades, about the thrill of hearing thousands of people singing along to songs he'd written 50 years ago. The co-host laughed at his anecdotes, asking follow-up questions that showed genuine interest. Kate smiled and nodded along, creating that comfortable atmosphere that makes for good television. And everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. They discussed his new album in detail, going through some of the tracks, talking about the creative process behind it, about the musicians he'd worked with, about how he approached recording now compared to when he first started. Cliff was generous with his answers, clearly enjoying himself, happy to share insights into his craft. He talked about how he'd managed to keep his voice in such remarkable shape after all these years, discussing his vocal exercises, his commitment to staying healthy, the discipline required to maintain that level of performance quality. The audience at home was probably having their morning coffee, half watching while getting ready for work, enjoying the familiar comfort of morning television at its best. Parents were probably getting children ready for school, while Cliff's voice provided pleasant background noise. This was exactly what Good Morning Britain was supposed to be: pleasant conversation with interesting people to ease viewers into their day without demanding too much attention or causing any stress. Kate then transitioned to discussing his legacy, his impact on British music and popular culture more broadly, his place in entertainment history alongside other icons of his generation. Cliff spoke humbly about his achievements, deflecting some of the praise with characteristic modesty, while acknowledging how blessed he'd been in his career, how fortunate he felt to have had the opportunities he'd received. He talked about the other artists who'd influenced him, naming musicians who'd inspired his style, who'd shown him different approaches to performance and recording. He discussed the changing landscape of the music industry, how different things were now compared to when he started in the late 50s and early 60s. He talked about the shift from physical albums to streaming, from radio play to social media promotion, from carefully crafted album releases to constant content creation. There was no bitterness in his observations, just thoughtful reflection on how the business had evolved and how he'd adapted to remain relevant across so many decades. It all felt safe, comfortable, exactly the kind of content that morning shows thrive on. The production team behind the cameras was probably relaxing, confident this segment would wrap up smoothly and they'd move on to the next story without any issues. They were likely already thinking about the commercial break, about timing, about how to transition to the next segment. Nobody expected what was about to happen. But then, Kate decided to shift the conversation to something more serious, something that would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. "Cliff," Kate said, her tone becoming slightly more formal, more journalistic. That shift that experienced television viewers recognize as the moment when an interview is about to get serious. "I do want to ask you about something that's been in the news recently. There's been ongoing discussion about historical allegations in the entertainment industry, about how these cases are handled, and obviously, you went through a very difficult period yourself a few years ago. How do you reflect on that time now? What's your perspective looking back?" The atmosphere in the studio changed immediately. It was subtle at first, but if you were paying attention, you could see it happen in real time. You could see it in Cliff's face, in the way his entire demeanor shifted in the space of a heartbeat. The warm, open expression he'd been wearing throughout the interview tightened noticeably. His smile didn't disappear completely, but it became fixed, frozen, more of a mask than a genuine expression of pleasure. His posture shifted slightly, his shoulders tensing, becoming more guarded, more defensive. "Kate," Cliff said slowly, his voice still controlled but with a new edge to it that hadn't been there before. "I'm here to talk about my music, about my tour. I think we agreed that was the focus of this conversation. That was what your producers told my team. That was the understanding we all had." Kate leaned forward slightly, her journalistic instincts clearly engaged now, sensing a story, sensing an opportunity for something more substantial than the light entertainment they'd been doing. "I understand. But surely you can appreciate that people are interested in your perspective on these issues. You were investigated, you were cleared completely and vindicated, and you've spoken publicly about how traumatic that experience was. Don't you think? There's value in discussing how these situations should be handled, in sharing your experience so others might learn from it. I think there's value in respecting what someone agrees to discuss when they come on your show," Cliff replied, and now his voice had definitely hardened, the friendly warmth completely gone. The decades of media training, of learning how to handle difficult questions with grace, seemed to be failing him in this moment. "We had an understanding about what this interview would cover. A very clear understanding. Your team reached out to my team. We discussed the parameters, We agreed on topics. And this wasn't one of them. The co-host tried to jump in, probably sensing the tension building like a pressure cooker about to explode, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. Kate, maybe we should move on to... But Kate wasn't backing down. She had that look in her eyes, that determination that journalists get when they believe they're onto something important, when they think they're asking the questions that need to be asked. Cliff, I'm not trying to upset you. I really am not. I'm asking legitimate questions about matters of public interest. You've been very vocal about your own experience in previous interviews. You've talked about it on other programs. Surely you understand why people want to hear your thoughts. Why this is relevant. Why it matters. What I understand, Cliff said, his jaw tightening visibly, the muscles in his neck becoming prominent as he fought to control his emotions, is that I was cleared of everything. Completely cleared. Vindicated. Exonerated. And yet here we are, years later, and you're still bringing it up like there's something to discuss. Like there's some question mark hanging over me. Like the cloud never lifted. Do you know how that feels? To be constantly reminded of the worst time of your life? Kate shook her head quickly, her expression defensive now, clearly not expecting this level of pushback. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm not suggesting there's any question about your innocence. I'm asking about the process, about how investigations like that are handled by the media and the police, about the impact on people who are falsely accused. That's an important conversation. That's something that needs to be discussed. Then have that conversation with someone else. Cliff's voice rose slightly, enough that you could hear the anger starting to break through his controlled exterior. Years of pain and frustration bubbling to the surface. Have it with lawyers, with politicians, with advocacy groups, with people who signed up for that conversation. Don't use me as your case study when I came here to talk about music. When I came here in good faith, expecting to discuss my work, my art, the things that actually matter to me right now. That's not fair, Kate. That's not right. That's ambush journalism, and you know it. The studio had gone very quiet now. Casual, comfortable atmosphere from just minutes ago had completely evaporated like morning mist. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the growing confrontation, every micro-expression, every gesture. Camera operators were probably getting signals in their earpieces to get close-ups, to capture the emotion playing out on both faces. The co-host looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between Kate and Cliff like someone watching a car accident unfold in slow motion, clearly out of his depth, unclear about whether to intervene or stay silent. Kate maintained her professional composure, but there was determination in her expression, a stubbornness that suggested she wasn't going to let this go easily. I think you're being overly sensitive about this, Cliff. These are reasonable questions. You've given interviews about this topic before. You've spoken to newspapers, you've been on other television programs discussing it. Why is it suddenly off limits now? What's different about this time? That's when something in Cliff seemed to snap. His face flushed red, the color spreading up from his neck, and he leaned forward in his chair with sudden intensity, his voice dropping to a low, intense tone that somehow felt more powerful than shouting, more dangerous than yelling. Overly sensitive? You want to talk about sensitive? Do you have any idea what it's like to have your entire life destroyed by false accusations? To have your home raided by police while news helicopters film it from above? To have your name dragged through the mud on every news channel? To see your face plastered across newspapers with the word allegations underneath it? To lose friends, to lose work, to lose everything you spent decades building, all because someone made up lies about you? I'm not trying to minimize what you went through, Kate began, but her voice lacked conviction now. Then stop bloody bringing it up. Cliff's voice exploded through the studio, louder now, the careful control completely abandoned, decades of restraint finally breaking. I came here as a favor, to promote my tour, to talk about music, to have a pleasant conversation, not to be ambushed with questions about the worst period of my life, not to relive trauma for your viewers' entertainment, not to be put on trial again by you on live television. The audience in the studio gasped audibly. You could hear it clearly. That collective intake of breath from people who couldn't believe what they were witnessing, who'd never expected to see this side of Cliff Richard. This was Cliff Richard, national treasure, beloved entertainer, the man who'd been knighted for his contributions to music and charity. And here he was, losing his temper on live television, his composure completely shattered. Kate's expression hardened visibly, her jaw setting, her eyes flashing with anger and indignation. Cliff, I didn't ambush you. I asked you a straightforward question about a matter of public record. If you can't handle basic questions about your public life, about things that are documented fact, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Maybe you should stay home if you're this fragile. Maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews if you can't keep your word about what you'll discuss. Cliff shot back, his voice shaking with anger now, his whole body trembling with the force of his emotion. We had an agreement. Your producers agreed. They gave their word. And now you're sitting here breaking that agreement on live television because you want to create drama, because you want a headline, because you care more about your ratings than you do about basic human decency, about treating people with respect. The co-host was frantically trying to regain control, looking desperately at the cameras, at the producers behind them who were visible in the background, making frantic hand gestures, clearly hoping someone would tell him what to do, how to salvage this disaster. Everyone, let's just take a breath here. Let's calm down. No, Kate interrupted, her own voice rising now, her professional mask cracking to show genuine offense underneath, real anger breaking through. No, I will not be lectured about journalistic integrity by someone who can't handle tough questions. This is a news program, Cliff. We ask questions. That's what we do. That's our job. If you don't like it, that's unfortunate. But it doesn't change what we do. Tough questions? Cliff's laugh was sharp, bitter, humorless. You call digging up someone's trauma for entertainment tough questions? You call breaking your word about interview topics journalism? That's not journalism, Kate. That's tabloid garbage dressed up as news. That's exploitation disguised as public interest. And you're better than this. At least I thought you were. Kate's face went red, her neck flushing with anger and embarrassment. You could see her struggling to maintain composure, to not escalate further. But she was clearly stung by the accusation, wounded by his words. How dare you? We are a legitimate news program. Just because you don't like the questions doesn't make them inappropriate. Just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean we shouldn't ask them. They're inappropriate when we specifically agreed not to discuss them. Cliff was on his feet now, standing up from his chair with enough force that it rolled backward several feet, the wheels squeaking against the studio floor. When you give your word and then break it, when you promise one thing and deliver another, that's not journalism. That's betrayal. That's lying. That's breaking trust. The studio was in complete chaos now. Producers could be seen moving urgently in the background, some with headsets pressed to their ears, probably getting instructions from the director's booth, trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial, whether to let this play out, whether to intervene physically and stop the broadcast. The co-host had his hands up like a referee, trying to separate boxers in a clinch, clearly out of his depth, never having dealt with anything like this in all his years of broadcasting. Kate stood up too, matching Cliff's energy, refusing to be intimidated, her own anger fully visible now. Sit down, Cliff. You're being ridiculous. This is a professional setting. Act like a professional. Stop throwing a tantrum on my show. I am acting like a professional. Cliff's voice was shaking with emotion now. Years of frustration and pain clearly bubbling to the surface like a volcano finally erupting. A professional who keeps his commitments, who respects agreements, who doesn't ambush people for ratings. Maybe you should try it sometime. Maybe you should remember what it means to treat people with dignity. Get out, Kate said suddenly, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The words were quiet, but carried immense weight, loaded with finality. If you can't conduct yourself appropriately, If you're going to stand there insulting me and my show and my integrity, then leave. Get out of my studio." Cliff stared at her for a long moment, his chest heaving with emotion, his breath coming in quick bursts. The entire studio held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Whether he'd sit back down, whether he'd apologize, whether this could somehow be salvaged. The cameras captured everything in excruciating detail. The anger on both faces, the shock on the co-host's face, the frozen expressions of the crew members visible in the background, the wide-eyed stares of audience members who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. "You know what?" Cliff's voice was suddenly very calm, very controlled, which somehow made it more devastating, more final. "I will. I'll gladly leave. Because I have more respect for myself than to sit here and be used for your entertainment. I've spent 60 years building a reputation on integrity and respect, and I won't throw that away by staying here one more second. Not for you, not for anyone." He reached up and unclipped his microphone with steady hands, despite the obvious emotion coursing through him, despite the trembling in his fingers. He placed it carefully on the chair he'd been sitting in, the small gesture somehow conveying more dignity than any words could. A final act of control in a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Kate crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her posture defensive and defiant. "Fine. Walk away. That's what people do when they can't handle the heat. That's what people do when they get called out. Run away and play the victim." Cliff turned to look at her one more time, and his expression was a complex mixture of anger, disappointment, hurt, and something that looked almost like pity. "I'm not running away from anything, Kate. I'm walking away from someone who doesn't understand the difference between journalism and cruelty. There's a difference, and you clearly don't see it. Maybe one day you will, but I won't hold my breath." "You're being dramatic?" Kate shot back, her voice sharp with frustration and anger, her composure completely gone now. "This is absurd. You're acting like a child who didn't get his way, like a diva who can't handle being questioned. And you're acting like a journalist who forgot that there are human beings on the other side of your questions," Cliff replied quietly, his voice dropping again to that low register that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "People with feelings, with trauma, with pain. But I guess that doesn't matter when you're chasing ratings. I guess human decency takes a back seat to entertainment value." He turned toward the exit, his movements dignified, despite the chaos of the moment, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Kate called after him, her voice sharp with frustration and anger and something that might have been regret. "You agreed to come on this show, Cliff. You don't get to control every aspect of the conversation. That's not how this works. That's not how journalism works." But Cliff didn't respond. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her words, didn't give her the satisfaction of another reaction. He simply walked across the studio floor with measured steps, past the cameras that tracked his movement, past the shocked crew members who stepped aside to let him through, past the stunned audience members whose mouths hung open in disbelief. His back was straight, his head held high, refusing to show weakness even in this moment of clear distress, maintaining his dignity even as everything fell apart around him. The co-host was speaking now, trying to fill the dead air, trying to explain to viewers what had just happened, but his words were fumbling, uncertain. "How do you explain watching a beloved national figure storm off your set? How do you contextualize a confrontation that had gone from friendly to hostile in a matter of minutes?" Kate stood at the desk, her arms still crossed, her face flushed with emotion. She was breathing heavily, clearly trying to process what had just happened, trying to figure out if she'd gone too far, or if she'd been justified in pressing the issue. The cameras stayed on her, capturing every nuance of her expression, the mixture of defiance and uncertainty. And Cliff Richard kept walking, past the studio doors, into the hallway beyond, leaving behind a show in complete disarray and a confrontation that nobody who witnessed it would ever forget. The door closed behind him with a solid thunk that seemed to echo through the silent studio. A final punctuation mark on one of the most shocking moments in British morning television history.